Welcome to the Bridge in Theology podcast, which connects scholarship to Christian life. Bridge in Theology is hosted by Drs. Beth Stovell, Claudia Herrera-Montero, Kevin Hill, Ryan Reed, and me, Candace Smith. Today's episode features a conversation with Kat Armas. Kat is a Cuban-American writer and podcaster from Miami, Florida. She holds a dual MDiv and MAT from Fuller Theological Seminary and is currently pursuing a THM at Vanderbilt Divinity School. Her first book is Abuelita Faith: What Women on the Margins Teach Us About Wisdom, Persistence, and Strength, which sits at the intersection of women, the Bible, and Cuban identity. She also explores these topics on her podcast, The Protagonistas, which centers the voices of Black, Indigenous, and other women of color in theological spaces. Our hosts for today are Claudia Herrera-Montero, who specializes in practical theology, and Beth Stovell, who specializes in biblical studies. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe to it, leave a rating in your podcast player, or consider sharing it with others through social media. And now, on with the conversation.
Thanks, Candace, and thank you for listening. I am Claudia Herrera.
And I am Beth Stovell. Today, we're very pleased to have with us Kat Armas. Kat, welcome to the Bridging Theology podcast. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited to be here.
Before we start with questions about your work, we are so grateful for for saying yes to our invitation. But also, we're also interested about you telling us something interesting about yourself that most people don't know.
Yeah, so let's see, there's definitely a few things, but I would say, and of course that changes, right? Like different seasons, like this is like a weird quirk of mine, but something that has remained pretty constant throughout my life is that I'm a huge horror nut. Like I love slashers and like just really grotesque, bloody horror films and shows, and mostly shows. But yeah, or also films here and there. But yeah, I just love some horror. I had a baby in October and I really wanted like my newborn baby to be all dressed like a bloody, gory, like, and everyone was like, yeah, don't do that. And I was like, but that would be so fun. Like a tiny little, like, what's the word? Like The Walking Dead, one of those.
Yes. Oh my gosh, Kat, we actually dressed our daughter when she was, I think, 2 for her first Halloween. We dressed her as Baby Death, and we had like a tiny little sickle, and she wore like a black hoodie. So I really connect to that. We actually did that.
So. That's amazing. Okay, I don't feel so bad now. I'm definitely going to do that next year.
Well, I know that you grew up in the outskirts of Miami's Little Havana, and Claudia and I both lived in Miami actually for many years. Claudia for longer than me, but I still claim Miami as one of my homes with my special memories. Can you share with us a special spot there or a special love there that brings back memories for you?
Yeah, so much. I feel like place and home, really lives within us. And as I talk about in Abuelita Faith, the land specifically lives within us. And I mean, everything about Miami from the second that I get off the plane and like the wet blanket of heat just, smacks me in the face. I'm like, and like listening to, all of the Cuban Uber drivers yelling out their window, aquí, and it's just, yeah, it's so great. But I would say, I grew up on 8th Street. My grandmother still lives, she lives in between Flagler and 8th Street, but my mom still lives like down 8th Street. And I mean, just driving down 8th Street and the folks, the selling mamoncillos on the side of the road. There's something about, the fruit on the side of the road in Miami that to me is just, I always have to stop and, get something and take it home and just eat it with my family. So I would say just being there.
Yeah, Calle Ocho, right? That's the street that you are addressing to. That reminded me that recently I had to drive close by and I saw the people of the fruit and took me back to my country, Colombia, that you could get fruit everywhere, wherever you go, and you just buy it on your way to college, on your way to grandma's home, on the way, and then not just the supermarket. So those are the little supermarkets that you find. So that's so powerful. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
So we're gonna jump right away to the first half of the questions, and so please tell us briefly about your work and what brought you to it.
Yeah, so I obviously growing up in Miami, I had such a unique connection to my culture. Most people around me were Latino, Latina, and primarily Cuban, obviously, that I interacted with. And I was raised Catholic, of course. There's such a strong connection to Catholicism and so many of the Cuban exiles, and so that was a very strong thing for me growing up. And of course, while you're growing up, you're not thinking about it, or you don't notice how much of that stuff sort of imprints into your soul. And it wasn't until I left Miami and I left my little Cuban haven and I left just my culture, and particularly to pursue theological education in a primarily, white evangelical, male-dominated space. It wasn't until I got there that I realized, wait a minute, there is something so unique and so powerful and so special, not necessarily or not just or only about my culture, but about the faith that I was brought up in. And I think that that's something, I really truly began to believe, because I was told, obviously, that, my grandmother, Abuela's faith wasn't legitimate, or, that she needed to be saved because she was Catholic, or, all of these things that I really began to believe, and I suffered so many existential crises those first few years as a Protestant. I say that I sort of transitioned into Protestantism. And so that really kind of sparked my interest in women and in, who I am as a Cuban, woman, and all of these realities, bringing that into just my study of God and my study of theology. So that's sort of how that began. And then as I continued my journey within seminary and I just fell in love with the Bible and its stories and just how complicated they are, and that's just the best thing, like not in a bad way, of course, but they're just so complicated and wonderful. And I saw so many connections to, my own abuela and my life in so many of the Bible stories. And so that's a little bit of how I got into that.
Thank you, Kat, for sharing that part, because I'm really fascinated about your work on Abuelita Faith. Particularly because my own research and pastoral work focuses on first generation college age Latinas and her families in South Florida. But when I was listening to the voices of these first generation young Latinas, the abuelas, the mothers, the grandmothers, they were critical part of their lives as they build on identity, as they construct identity, and as well as they grow and live out a faith that, as you said, has been invisible to the dominant culture and has been colonized at the same time by the dominant culture. So that's when I saw your work. I was fascinated, but also very inspired that somebody else recognized in one book the Abuela's faith. So with this, I would like to ask you, would you please share more about your work on Abuelita Faith and tell us again what brought you to it? Particularly go deeply into the stories, into your abuela, into your experience and your lived experience as a woman.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I would love to hear more about your work. So I have to interview you one day about that.
I would love to.
But yeah, so for me, in Abuelita Faith, in the first chapter, I write about what I call research grief. And it's just this idea that, as you're doing research, and in many ways, theological education, because it began primarily just for white males and by white males, right? As like a Western, a white European thing. In many ways, theological education, the way that I was trained in the beginning, in that context, is very much divorced from lived experience, right? It's very heady and very, you do all these things, you think about God and you theologize about God, but it very rarely touches lived experience. And I think that was something, as I'm learning all these things about God, and I write about this in Abuelita Faith, it really had nothing to do with my lived experience. I was like, well, this has nothing to do with me. This has nothing to do with my reality, nothing to do with Abuela and her faith and the faith that formed me. And that's why I say, like, I really, began to have these, identity crises and really start to question, well, what role does God play in the life of my abuela and so many people in my community who have similar experiences. So when I talk about research grief, I was just doing, research on the history of the church as it relates to women, but even that, it was European women. And I thought, well, what about Cuban women? Like, what is the history, and that's when I really began to dig deep into just the history of colonization in the Caribbean, right? And that's when I say that it became very personal. I mean, we all know about the history of colonization, and we know that intellectually, but I felt that generationally in my bones, in my body, because this is the history of my people. I wear these scars in my DNA. I wasn't aware of it at the time, but as I began doing this, what was just a research paper became, very personal research grief. And so that's where I just began to wrestle with, well, this Jesus, who is this Jesus? This the same Jesus that Abuela knows? Is this the Jesus that saved me? Is this the Jesus that she met, on her island? And just began to ask all of these questions. And then with that, I began to really investigate, well, what did Abuela's faith look like? How did she live it out? Because she didn't lead a Bible study, she didn't preach at church, obviously. But her faith was lived out in just literally from the second she woke up in the morning until the second she went to bed. And it was in her surviving, right? It was in her feeding her family. It was in her sewing, because that's what she had to sell in order to make money to pay for the food that was on the, and that's what brought forth all the community and all of the, little abuelitas in our home that were constantly in the house. And it was in her dancing salsa. And that was how she allowed herself to be the fullness of who she was, after working herself to the bone and taking care of her family by herself as a widow, Monday through Sunday. And so I'm starting to find all these threads of, well, wait, God was there. Oh, wait a minute. No, that was spiritual, and it was just how she lived her life. And it wasn't divorced or separated from her everyday experiences. I mean, God was in all of that. And I think that that's something that the academy, theological education just couldn't teach me, couldn't even name really at all. And so, so that's how I began to sort of think through this stuff. And like you said, Claudia, I mean, that this is the experience of so many, young women. This is the experience of so many second generation, even first and third generation Latinas and Latinos. And so I thought, this needs to be named. We need to write this down and tell it like it is, a sacred truth, really.
Yeah. Something that I appreciate with that is how much you, as somebody who yourself has a formal education, how you see those without formal education, those who are often on the margins, as vital and valuable sources of theology and biblical interpretation. And I'd love for you to talk more about how that emerged for you personally, and especially how it shaped what theology means to you or what interpreting the Bible means to you.
Yeah, it's funny because when I talk to folks about this, I have, several theology degrees and I'm getting another one. And so I'm not against, Western education, of course. But also I'm like, arguing that it's like not, the thing that we should be pursuing. So it's like, I think it's a both and, right? And I think that that's most things. I mean, if we want to decolonize, as I talk about in my book, from Western thinking, we have to be okay with the both and the non-binary thinking and all of that. But anyway, when it comes to the formal, informal, I always like to think that, if the formal education is the only thing, or where we, are to receive all the knowledge, well, then we're really missing out on a lot. Because for only a short period of time and only a small group of people have been able to tell us what is knowledge or what is not. And I think that that's sort of the thing that I wrestle with in Abuelita Faith is really, what is knowledge and who gets to say, who has it? What is wisdom? Who gets to call the shots? And obviously, we know who has. But I want to look at the different ways of knowing and being in the world, right? Like how do people cross the globe? How have they made meaning of their existence? And to me, and if we read in scripture, I mean, that is wisdom, right? Just discernment and knowing what to do and doing, the deeply right thing, as so many women in the Bible do. They're living out this embodied wisdom that they learn through just, again, trying to survive, like trying to make it through the next day. Mm-hmm. And it's a very simple, informal, but deeply profound, truth that we find in scripture and in the stories of so many of our abuelitas. And so I saw that in my grandmother's story of just how the wisdom that she had. And none of it was anything that she received, she didn't receive a seminary education. I don't even think she received education past elementary school, but she had like a deep well of wisdom, and it was passed down to her from her ancestors, right? An oral sort of wisdom. And that's true for so many of our communities. They have this wisdom that comes from surviving and survival and, this ancestral wisdom that comes from the body.
What's interesting is, that, one of the things that I get to do, I work in the city in Indigenous communities, and specifically around truth and reconciliation, and how do we change, really, how do we decolonize some of the policies and things like that. But one of the conversations we had is around knowledge and who holds knowledge, or how do we value knowledge. And I remember having a conversation with my co-chair for the work that we do, who is Cree Mohawk, and I said, Who for you are the professors? And she started talking about elders and the way they hold knowledge, and that knowledge from generation to generation of the land and of the people, and how that can be honored as a way of knowing. And so it's been really, as somebody who I'm a professor as my job, it's made me think a lot about how do we think about how we hold knowledge and what it means to have knowledge. And so I really appreciate that, Kat.
Yeah. Absolutely. And also it reminds me, what you are just saying reminds me, Martel Otero on her chapter, Abuelita mm-hmm. Theologies, she talks about that always the voices of the wise female or woman in the house are the sobrajas, the leftover for the dominant culture, but on the other side, they are the organic theologians, like Ana Maria Isasi Diaz mm-hmm. usually mentioned when she worked with the women out in the streets, in the fields, in the margins of our society. So that what you're just saying reminds me of that and takes me to actually a very important point. In Latinx theology, Latinoix theology, we talk about lo cotidiano as the locus theological, the everyday, la lucha, also the struggle, as a theological sources, as a way for us to know, to do, to be with and among theologians as a point of departure. Our teologías de la casa, del hogar, how Martel Otero says. In your book, you have 2 chapters that particularly called my attention. One about sobreviviendo, that reminds me of survival. Ana Maria Isasi Diaz talks about survivals, but survival not necessarily has to do with just recognizing the struggles and the trials and tribulations that are part of life, but actually the call to fully live, to fully become and be and know in this world. So I'm interested about your chapter of Resolviendo en la Lucha, sorting out things in the struggle. I would say that sometimes they don't have translations.
Right, exactly.
But would you please tell us more about these two sections of your book, Sobreviviendo o Resolviendo en la Lucha?
Yeah, there's just so much. As I was trying to articulate just think through this theology, this Abuelita theology, I think those two things kept coming to mind. A theology of survival, and a theology of resolviendo, right? Like, it's like, as I've been saying over and over again, it's just a theology of just trying to make it to the next day. And also a theology, and I got this idea of resolviendo from a book by Cristina Garcia Alfonso, and she talks about resolviendo in Cuba, and she talks about how, it's this idea of, we just got to figure it out, right? Like, we just have to do whatever we got to do to figure out what our next meal is going to be, or to figure, we don't have the luxury of a 5-year plan, or we just got to, and obviously she's talking about Cubans on the island, which is very different than Cubans in Miami. But yeah, and I really love that. I felt like that spoke to so much of the experiences across the globe, across our communities, and particularly, even in a theological sense, this idea of daily bread, right? This idea of, God, I just need what I need for today, not for tomorrow or next week. I just need you to provide today, to be my strength today. And I thought that was so powerful, this idea of resolviendo. And I saw that again in the life of so many in my community. You just got to do what you got to do to survive, right? And that together, went along with this idea of survival. And you see that in so many women in the Bible. And I think that to me is what was so powerful, is that this has been just the lived experiences of so many women across history. And what is so incredible is that God calls that blessed, right? Like, so many women throughout history we don't need to over spiritualize it. It's not this like, no, they were just trying to make sure that their people didn't die, right? And God was like, oh, you are blessed, or they are called righteous. I mean, you think of Tamar, and what she does to ensure her survival for the future, with her father-in-law, and she is called righteous for that, right? And not only that, but these women are in the lineage of Jesus. I mean, they are, in the direct genealogy of Jesus when we read in the beginning of Matthew. And so, yeah, I found so much, this idea of survival, this idea of resolviendo, of just figuring it out, of just living day by day, as that is in and of itself holy. There doesn't, like I said, it doesn't need to be spiritualized. It is a holy and sacred act. And we see that in the Bible, and we see that in the lives of so many of our abuelas, that their surviving is holy, period. Nothing else.
Yeah, as an Old Testament scholar, something I really appreciate. Not surprisingly, my favorite chapters are when you spend a lot of time talking about the Bible itself. I love the chapter called Mujeres of Exodus, and you draw this comparison. And actually, when I read it, I thought, Kat and we've been having a secret conversation no one knows about, because this is what I say to my students when they have their first class in the Old Testament. We talk about when they hit a space, it's so complex in the Old Testament. I encourage them to wrestle with God the way that Jacob wrestled for a blessing. And I love that you use this same kind of comparison of wrestling with God the way that Jacob wrestled. And I would love for you to share a little more about what this wrestling process with God has been, and with the Bible in your own journey.
Yeah, I think that has been, the majority of how I can describe my faith and my study of the Bible. I think, and you would understand this, as someone who teaches and studies the Bible, but I mean, the more that you wrestle with that text, the more complicated it becomes, and the more questions that you have, and the more, and I think that that is the beauty of it, right? I mean, that is the beauty of a sacred living, as I would say, a sacred living text. Obviously, everybody has their own ways of speaking about it, but yeah, as I would call a sacred living text. And that's something that is alive, right? That it is something that is, just constantly, there's an ebb and a flow, and there's a change and and it changes you as you study it. And so, yeah, that's been so much of my study. I know that Will Gaffney, she talks about, and she mentioned, and I think I quoted her in Abuelita Faith, because she said something like, I think it was one of her blogs or something, she said something like, you should wrestle with the text until you walk away with a limp. And I just love that, because it's this idea of wrestling with the text until it hurts, until it does something in you. And I think that is a lot of what I wanted to do in Abuelita Faith. I'll look at decolonial readings and I'll say, well, look, the destruction of the Canaanites. I mean, we should question that, right? We should question, what it means to take over a people, to colonize a people. We should wrestle with, what it means that we've been reading a specific passage this way, but what if we were to look at it this way? And to offer all these sort of lenses of which to look at the text, because, again, as I mentioned in my book, that the Bible, it's not just a book about history, but it makes and it changes history. It has changed and made history in good ways and in terrible, horrific ways. And so I think that, yeah, we need to be constantly investigating that in order for the liberation, right, of us all.
Yes, it's interesting. One of the professors I had in my doctoral degree, Cindy Westfall, used to say, when you touch the Bible, it should burn you. And that, it should, yeah. And if it's not, then it means that you've been too comfortable. Yeah. And so, can you let it burn you in that refining way that's reshaping you to see through new eyes? And so, something you mentioned in terms of coming to liberation, you have this wonderful quote in that book, in that chapter. Ironically, while Pharaoh thinks men pose a threat to his power, he overlooks the real threat. God is using women to set the scene for liberation. And you have this whole exploration of the different women and their roles in liberation, both in the Exodus story and elsewhere in Scripture. I would love for you to talk a little more about that picture of the role of women and liberation.
Yeah. And so in my research, whether it was throughout history, because I talk about, a lot of women throughout history that are just fighting for their own and their people's liberation, and also women throughout Scripture, obviously. And I think something that I found, and I think one of the most interesting characters for me was Rizpah in that sense, because, of course, her story, so many people have no idea who she is, or had no idea, who she, and even me, I mean, after taking several exegetical courses, in Hebrew and Old Testament courses and all these things, no one had ever taught on Rizpah. But I think what's so fascinating about Rizpah is not just that she protested, the unjust murders of her sons for 6 months, but it was from her protest that God ended the famine that was in Israel. I mean, literally her protest, allowed the people to eat, and I think that is something that is so overlooked, how, her enacting her own agency, her engaging in protests, like all of these things that leads us toward liberation. All of these things, we find in the story of Rizpah that is untold, that is overlooked, that is just completely, And again, so many of the women in the Bible, I feel like that is something that it's in the background, that so many things are happening in the background. And of course, we miss that in Scripture because it's a book written by men and for men. I mean, that's just the fact of it. But yeah, when you really dig deep, you find, I wrote about the women in Cuba, how they were sort of in the background of so many movements, and they were engaging in protest, phone chains and all of these things that would go unnoticed because women, quote unquote, don't do those things, right? So yeah, and of course we see that in the women of Exodus, how they are engaging in civil disobedience. I mean, you see that so much throughout the Bible, and I just love it. I mean, Esther, she's leading her people toward liberation. And so, yeah, and I think that Rizpah is like just the perfect picture of that. Besides, obviously, the women in Exodus.
Yeah, that actually is so powerful how you mention the importance of claiming on liberation. And when I think about liberation, I also think about also claiming on memoria histórica or historical memory. And language is part of that historical memory or memoria histórica. So I'm thinking about how you intentionally navigate not only through the title of your book, but also in between in your chapters. You navigate in between both languages, English and Spanish, and I see it not only as a symbol of liberation or claiming on memoria histórica, but I would like to actually learn more from you. Would you tell us about the importance of claiming on, of that use of Spanglish, of that use of navigating between those two and in between those two and in your work?
Yeah. Thank you so much for asking me that, because that was, of course, very intentional. And I even made sure when I spoke to my publisher, I said, I don't want the Spanish words italicized. I want them to be, just like every other word. I don't want them to, quote unquote, stand out in that way as different. Or, I want folks to, as they're reading, to force themselves to sort of read through the word before they get to the English word in parentheses. And so, yeah, so that was intentional. It's funny, I'm writing on language right now, and I've just been wrestling with this idea how in John chapter 1, in the beginning was the word. And in Spanish that says in the beginning was el verbo, it was the verb, And I think that is just, to me, speaks so much about the beauty and mystery of language, but also the beauty and mystery of God, right? How there are words, and I think you said this earlier in the beginning, that there are words that are untranslatable, right? Like resolviendo, it's like you can't really resolving. Like, I don't know, there's not really a translation for it. But I love that, because I think that speaks to the sacredness of language and how God makes God's self known in such particular and unique and different ways in each culture, right? Because if you understand Jesus as a verb, that is very different. I mean, if that's all you've ever heard growing up, Jesus is a verb, versus Jesus is a word. I mean, they're both very powerful, but they're completely different. Like, you're understanding Jesus in two totally different ways, obviously according to John. And so I find that just so fascinating and so beautiful and so sacred. And so I wanted to, just continue to affirm that in this book. And obviously, Spanglish, both of you lived in Miami. I mean, that is, the language. I mean, there's not really, Spanish and English, but there's Spanglish. And that's just how I was raised speaking, even to this day, I just still, kind of go back and forth between languages. And so I think that is, it was important for me to, bring my full self to this work.
Something I love about that is, we have this picture in Revelation as the, so this picture of worship of God where all people are speaking in their own languages. And there is something about that powerful picture that worship comes in the spaces where all of us speak in the language that is given to us, right? And that we speak from I know Claudia and I've talked before about like our heart language, right? The language at the core of who we are. And I love that. So I get to have the fun switch over. We're going to switch to some fun questions. Although I always say I think all of these are fun questions from the start, but these are the ones that are, meant to be a little fun in a different way. So if you could eat any meal every day for the rest of your life, what meal would it be?
So I and you know, my family hates this, but I'm a vegetarian, so I don't eat meat. And literally, it's been 15 years into this, and my family's still like, "Ay, pero come on," you know, like it's just a little bit, you know. I'm like, no. So I will say, I just love Indian food. I love like some good paneer cheese and some good, you know, chickpeas, and yeah. So I would say, probably just a good Indian dish, or pizza. I love pizza. I had pizza at my engagement, my wedding. Like we were just like, let's just do pizza all around. So yeah.
That is wonderful. You know, yeah, I think vegetarian food, in terms of vegetarian food, Indian food is so good for that, but Italian food too. Like they're both so good. So.
And what you say about vegetarian reminds me, my husband is vegetarian.
Oh, yeah.
And we're going to go to Colombia, hopefully, after all this comes down. And I always say,
Yeah.
prepárate of what you are going to say when my abuela asks you, mijito, sit down on the table, prepárate. And you're going to have to be no more vegetarian for our trip, you know, because there is no way.
It makes no sense. Yeah, like abuela still is like, ay, chica, por favor. You know, like she's like, come on. And I'm like, you know, it just, they literally does not compute in their minds.
No, mijita. No, mijita. That's my abuela. So we're kind of preparándonos, preparing the way, you know? You know, so yeah, I love that question. So the second. So what is your favorite movie or film?
So I'm not a huge movie person. I know I'm so weird and terrible. I just get lost and I get bored, but I love TV shows because they're shorter. So I can fit like an hour and I can focus and, you know, and that's it. And then the next night I'll watch another. I loved, well, first of all, Jane the Virgin will always forever be like my heart show because I mean, Miami, abuela, mom, you know, it was like literally my childhood. It was very, like, I literally didn't meet my father until I was older, just like her. Like, it was like so bizarre how much Jane the Virgin and I had in common. Did not have a virgin birth, but everything else was very close. And also I was a teacher actually before I became a writer, and she was a teacher. It was really sweet watching that. And also I just absolutely adored The Walking Dead, particularly season 2. There is one of the best episodes of any show I've ever seen in my entire life. Season 2 of The Walking Dead. I'll have to say those are my two favorite. I'm sorry, I literally could not think of a movie.
That's all good. That's all good.
Time someone
Series
asks
are
me,
the
I'm
best.
like,
No, you asked that you answer a question with you gave a good answer. So that's what
Yes.
we want here. So if you could take an all expense paid trip somewhere and you didn't have to worry about pandemics or whatever, where would you go?
So that also will change depending on like how I'm feeling in that time of my life. So right before COVID started back in 2020, my spouse and I had a trip planned to Asia. Neither of us had ever been, and then we kept pushing it back, and then of course we had to just completely cancel it. So I would say, just in general, I would love to finally visit Asia. I've never been. I know Asia's like abroad. We were going to we were going to spend some time in the Philippines. We were going to spend some time, just in different places. But right now I have a newborn, and so I just want to go to a beach and just all you can eat and drink and do absolutely nothing. So right now I just literally want to do nothing.
I understand. I remember a newborn. I remember that stage twice.
Me
and
too.
So
Me too.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. I love it. If you could have coffee or tea with any historical biblical theology figure, who would you choose? Who would that be?
So of course, Ada Maria Sassi Diaz would definitely be one. But writing, yeah, she's just, obviously just there's so much that I would love to talk to her about. But in writing Abuelita Faith, I wrote a chapter on dance, and Celia Cruz was just so big for me growing up, and such a huge part of, and even in writing this book, there was just, I remembered how much I adored her. And as a, Black Cuban woman, who her rise to fame was in the midst of such patriarchal and complicated politically, obviously, with the revolution and all during that time. And she's definitely not a biblical or theological, although she could be theological, depending on how we, what our parameters for that are. But I would say Celia Cruz is one, besides Esas Ideas.
And I can only imagine to be on a table with those two.
Yeah. That would be an amazing conversation.
Candela.
That would be amazing. Yeah.
That would be amazing. That would be really so amazing. Oh, thank you. That's awesome.
So with the second half of our conversation, we're going to switch over to talking a little bit about the church and like your spiritual life and faith.
Okay, so let's do that. I'm going to lead this set of questions. So I'm going to start. How has your research and work enriched your faith and spiritual life and vice versa?
Yeah, well, definitely, the first thing I can think of is looking for the abuelitas, not just my biological ones, but abuelitas in unexpected places, in unexpected people, finding, sort of the wisdom there. But also not just the abuelitas, and just looking for the sacred or the divine, finding God in unexpected places, through unexpected people, right? The places that the academy doesn't train us to look for wisdom. And in unassuming things, right? Like children or nature or, going outside and taking a walk and finding God. I've also been writing. So I'm working on a second book. So if I say I'm writing on this, but so I've been writing on just sort of nature and all that. And I'm writing a chapter on just birds and how I never knew anything interesting about birds. I mean, my husband loves birds, but I didn't know anything about birds. And, I'm finding that this one bird that has been, quote unquote, really annoying in my, in my home, that it's always outside in the springtime, not right now, although they're probably going to come out soon. But it's this bird that just is very obnoxious. But I'm finding out like all of these really incredible and beautiful, amazing things about this bird as I'm doing research on this bird. And I'm like, that is so like such a perfect description, of like something that is just annoying and unassuming and like, leave me alone. And there is just so much beauty and wisdom to behold in this creature. And so, yeah, just looking for God in unexpected and unassuming places and people and things and creatures.
That's wonderful. Actually, I started going for walks in this park that's really close to my house. And because it's a park that is so near us, I go every season, even when it's like super snowy or when it's really hot. And there's a tree that I've kind of become friends with. Like I've gotten to see the tree go through all the different stages of its life. And I almost am like rooting for the tree, but also I feel like I keep seeing how by seeing it, by understanding it, it teaches me things, and so I wonder, it sounds like you said some of these already. So, but some of the spiritual practices, I mean, we've all been through, probably, I assume you as well, through some difficult spaces of late. This has not been an easy season, I think. What have been spiritual practices that have kept you going through these different spaces?
Yeah, I would say that definitely trying to get outside and trying to, I love how you mentioned just befriending that tree and, recognizing something that I was reading recently is that the same word in the Bible, and I'm sure you know this because you studied Hebrew, but that for animals, they use the word nefesh, which is soul. And that's something which is so bizarre to me, how we say that animals don't have souls when it's, a similar word is used. So there's an argument, you can make an argument for that. And that's something a lot of people don't really know. Right. And so I was thinking about that recently, because one of my cats died unexpectedly, last year and it was really hard. And I just really, really struggled with it. I mean, I could not stop crying for months, months. It was unexpected. And and I was like, but why? You feel silly, right? You feel silly crying over, this cat. And you tell people, oh, I know, but, and try to explain why it hurts so much. And reading about that, that nefesh. And I was like, oh my gosh, no, that there was something in my kitty and there was something in me and our souls connected. And it's not silly that it hurt that bad. And anyway, I know that this doesn't answer your question, but I think it just goes back to this idea that there's divinity, there's something sacred there. And not just in my cat, but in every encounter that I have, in every single thing that I do. I love how in the Bible, you see this, I think Jacob does this. And I think, a lot of the quote unquote, forefathers do this, but they'll encounter God and they don't know that they encountered God, or it'll kind of just happen. And then they kind of think back, oh, wait, God was there. And then they'll build a little altar to like, sort of like commemorate that moment as sacred, or like a moment where God was. And I just love that. That actually was a spiritual practice that has been for me when I was outside more, because it's been cold. But that was something that I was doing a lot, is just when I felt like I encountered the divine, just kind of stopping and pausing and commemorating that space as holy. And I would even put little rocks, together, and like, this was a holy space and this was a holy moment. And I think that was something for me that helped me just to remember, like, oh, God was right here. And God was right there. And even on this walk, I was on a walk once and I did that. Like, God was right here,
I love that. Something about encountering God in these everyday spaces around us where God can meet us, and through physical, like the natural world. Actually, I've been working on this actually co-written paper with a biologist, and it's been really interesting because we were talking about naming animals, and exactly that nefesh connection between the different living beings. That Adam is a living being, and his giving name to animals as an act of care and love and compassion to the animal life, and that connection between the two of them, like acknowledging that connection. And so there's something really powerful that we often, historically, we've often downplayed the land and animals, and to raise up human beings, but there's such a value to both of those things throughout Scripture. And so I love that. So.
Absolutely. And also, as you speak about space, I'm thinking about how can we, the power of naming ourselves and naming in that space. So you speak at the beginning of our conversation about the role of women, right? Our embodiment as women, and not only in the public, but also in the church, right? How has your work affirmed or strengthened your understanding of the role of women in the church today? A particular example that you would like to share with where you had to claim on leadership and identity as a woman?
Yeah. Well, first of all, the church wouldn't be anything, without women. And also, the church has missed out a lot and has gone so wrong without, in the way that because it has suppressed the voice of women. And so it's one of those like weird juxtapositions, right? Like, it would be nothing without women, but also it's in a really bad place in many ways, because not just its control over women, but over things like nature and things like just people in general, right? Just this wanting to control and rule over. But anyway, I always say that I had the advantage of being raised by a single mother and a single grandmother. Obviously, at that time, that was very hard for me to not have, to not have a relationship with my father and those things. But it gave me an advantage in that I saw abuela and mom, be both mom and dad, and they played both of those roles, and they raised me to, advocate for myself and to be loud and to, be opinionated and not be afraid of that, to go for all the things that I wanted to achieve and all of those things. And so when I arrived in these, church spaces that were not very welcoming, to say the least, for women, I had the advantage of saying, wait a minute, this doesn't work out practically. You know what I mean? Like, what about me, who was raised by a single mother and a single grandmother? I never had anyone that I had to quote unquote submit to in the way that the church expected me to. So what does that mean for me? What does that mean? Does that mean that my entire life I was living in sin, or I was just, like wrong or whatever? So I experienced a lot of that when I first arrived in that context. And that was very hard for me. But I think because of my lived experience and because of the strong women in my life, I was able to just completely like disregard a lot of that, yeah. And, it was hard, but I think that is something that, for me, I've seen in my work and in my research and in the Bible. The people of God are nothing without women. Again, Rizpah ended a famine because of her audacity to protest, right? But at the same time, the church has missed out on a lot, I think. And of course, God, we can say that God is sovereign and all those things, but I still think that the church, we've gotten a lot wrong because of the way that we've treated women.
Something that I really appreciate about your work is the way you see specific contexts that flow into theology and faith. And I mean, we've obviously talked a lot about that so far. I would really love to hear you talk a little bit about how you think context can shape churches today, and maybe even the parts of that give you hope about that picture.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think, all theology is contextual, right? Everything is subjective. All of our theologizing and talking about God stems from our own lived experiences and in our own context. And I think that, it's not a matter of inviting context, but it's a matter of just acknowledging it, right? It's a matter of just acknowledging that everyone has their own lens through which they understand God. And man, the church would be it's such a beautiful place. And I do see hope in many places of the church. I mean, even this conversation for me is hopeful. And because God is moving most powerfully in the places where theology is quote unquote most contextual, right? That is where God is. That's where, I see God's movement. And if we would just acknowledge that, and I always say that, I talk about this in Abuelita Faith, but like a decolonized view of hospitality is, not inviting folks to our table, but, recognizing that folks have their own tables, right? Like marginalized communities, like women, Abuela had her own table and we were guests at her table. She set the table, she cooked, she told us what we're eating that night, so I think that, the church needs to learn how to be a good guest.
Yes.
And I always think, because, I think the church is so used to being the hosts and so used to being the one to set the table. But I think the church should just and I say church as, dominant culture. Mm-hmm. I think dominant culture, should just learn how to be a good guest. I mean, Jesus was a good guest. He sat at unfamiliar tables all the time. And I think about, the history of colonization. Imagine what imagine where what our history would be, or where our countries would be if, the colonizers learned how to be, were guests instead of, when they arrived, and were able to be good guests instead of the opposite.
That's actually been a powerful part of the conversation as I work with Indigenous people, is learning to be a guest. And one of the things that comes up in the conversations is a lot is, can you accept the invitation to be a guest, right?
Yeah.
And that's I think that's just such a powerful overturning. Good. And in some ways that the beauty of the upside down kingdom pictures that we see that push us towards pictures of liberation. So That's wonderful, Kat. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and as you talk about guests and as well as the table of the grandma, it reminds me. I recently wrote an article of Mis Abuelas y la Teología, right?
Oh, awesome.
And I speak about the table of my grandma, the table of my abuela. When I talk about the communal dimension of lo cotidiano, there was always a chair, there was always a space on her table, and there was always plate where we sit down, when we are welcome, and where we are all invited to be part of the conversation and claim our voice as well as our space en la mesa de la abuela. So with that, we We really thank you for this powerful conversation, for your insights, for your reflections, for your work. I enjoyed very much the conversation personally in my own work, in my own lived experiences as a Latina immigrant in this country, and as well as a scholar and teacher as well. So thank you, Kat, for joining us today. It's been a real pleasure talking to you. Thank you again for joining us.
Thanks for listening to today's episode. If you'd like to learn more about the podcast, visit our website at bridgingtheology.com. If you'd like to support the show, please subscribe to it in your podcast player, rate it, or share it with others. This episode was produced by Kevin Hill.